November 1927, Fifth Avenue, New York City. A light frost glinted on the sidewalks as workers in heavy coats surrounded the corner of 57th Street with scaffolding, tools, and grim purpose. Their target wasn't a decaying tenement or an old industrial shell. It was a palace. The largest private residence ever constructed in Manhattan, built for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the grandson of the man who helped build America's railroad empire. A house of 130 rooms, stretching across an entire city block, once thundered with the voices of butlers, footmen, and the privileged elite. Now it stood silent. Its carved limestone walls, steeply pitched slate roofs, and stained glass windows loomed like a ghost from another century. It had stood for only 45 years, but the world it embodied had aged centuries. The wrecking ball swung not just at stone and mortar, but at a way of life. This is the story of how a home more magnificent than many royal palaces was destroyed, not by fire, not by war, but by something far more revealing: indifference. Not a single heir wanted it. Not a single buyer stepped forward. It was too expensive, too outdated, too grand for the modern world. And what does that say about the society that once demanded it be built? Stick with us as we uncover how one of the greatest symbols of American wealth collapsed into rubble, and what it reveals about the rise and fall of the Gilded Age itself. Before we dive deeper, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more powerful untold stories from America's forgotten past. Comment below where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. We love seeing history connect across time zones. And if this mystery of a fallen palace intrigues you, share this video with a friend who appreciates a good historical unraveling. Let's see who really understands the mystery behind the title. This was no ordinary demolition. The Vanderbilt Mansion had been a monument to a lost order, a grand proclamation of power, wealth, and permanence. Designed by famed architect George Brown Post in the French Renaissance style, it cost over $3 million to build in 1882, a figure that would exceed $90 million today. Inside, one could find gilded ceilings, imported marble from Italy, staircases wide enough for a parade of gowns, a two-story library, and a grand ballroom lit by flickering gas chandeliers. But by 1927, it had become too much, too big, too expensive, too outdated. It wasn't destroyed by fire, nor by war. It was brought down by taxes, labor shortages, and a cultural shift that made such splendor feel shameful rather than enviable. Alice Vanderbilt, the widow of Cornelius II, had lived in the mansion for decades after his death in 1899. She kept the staff, the silver, and the status alive into the 1920s, refusing to surrender the rituals of her class. But when she passed away in 1926, her children inherited more than just property. They inherited a burden. The annual property tax bill alone was $30,000. The cost of heat, lighting, repairs, and a skeleton staff pushed expenses north of $100,000 each year. And to truly live in it, to uphold its legacy would require dozens of servants and a social calendar full of lavish events. None of the heirs wanted the responsibility. They didn't need a palace. They preferred modern apartments, smaller homes, and country estates that didn't demand a full-time staff of 50. The younger Vanderbilts, raised on privilege, were no longer interested in performing aristocracy. So the house went up for sale. Initially priced at $7 million, not a single private buyer stepped forward. The land, not the building, was what interested the market. The house once seen as the ultimate statement of wealth and culture, was now a liability. Finally, the luxury department store Bergdorf Goodman made an offer, not for the residence, but for the land it occupied. They wanted to build something new, something that would invite customers rather than intimidate them, something modern, something that belonged to a new America. As the demolition began, New Yorkers watched with mixed emotions. Crowds gathered along Fifth Avenue, peering through barricades as the ornate rooftop was pried apart tile by tile. Newspapers chronicled the process like an obituary, printing photos of the walls collapsing, the windows gone, the ballroom exposed to the sky. Some pieces were salvaged: mantels, oak panels, bits of stained glass, but most went to landfill. A few families collected fragments, relics of a vanished dynasty, but the rest vanished, carted away like debris from any ordinary construction site. The demolition took several months. From top to bottom, the mansion was methodically erased, a staircase that had once welcomed ambassadors, opera singers, and society's elite now led to a heap of rubble. The symbolism was lost on no one. This wasn't just the end of a home. It was the end of an age, a world in which one family could occupy an entire city block, surrounded by liveried staff and gilded furnishings, no longer made sense. The Gilded Age had built monuments so extravagant they seemed untouchable, but nothing in America is immune to change, especially not privilege. The fall of the Vanderbilt Mansion wasn't unique. By the time it was torn down, it was merely the most visible casualty in a larger trend. All along Fifth Avenue, similar homes were coming down, some quietly, others with front-page coverage. The world that had made them possible was dissolving. Labor costs had risen. Servants had found better-paying work in factories or offices. Property taxes had been restructured to reflect real market values. The federal income tax, introduced in 1913, ensured that the ultra-rich could no longer avoid contributing to the state. By 1927, even the richest families were feeling the pinch, not impoverished, not struggling, but constrained in ways they had never expected. The neighborhood was changing too. Fifth Avenue, once known as Millionaire's Row, was evolving into a commercial corridor. Offices, department stores, and apartment buildings replaced mansions. The once gated world of the elite was now surrounded by neon lights, elevator shafts, and commerce. The wrecking of the Vanderbilt home symbolized a broader truth. The Gilded Age had lost its grip not only on the economy, but on the imagination of the country. And the timing wasn't accidental. America in the 1920s was a country in flux. The trauma of World War I had transformed its values. Women had entered the workforce. The middle class was growing, and the working class was demanding better treatment and higher wages. The extravagant excess of old money families felt vulgar to a generation that had just buried millions in the mud of France. And so, when the largest mansion on Fifth Avenue came crashing down, it wasn't met with rebellion. It was met with a strange calm, a shared understanding. That house no longer belonged in this city, or in this era. Still, some mourned. Old society pages ran tributes to the Vanderbilt legacy. Architects lamented the loss of a one-of-a-kind structure. Preservationists, though few and far between at the time, wrote editorials begging the city to reconsider. But progress didn't pause. The rubble was cleared. In its place rose the new Bergdorf Goodman building, an Art Deco marvel with clean lines and massive windows, designed not to house a family but to attract thousands of customers each day. Commerce had replaced aristocracy. Efficiency had replaced opulence. The past had been demolished, and modernity had taken its place. But this wasn't just a matter of bricks and blueprints. It was a moment when America asked itself who it wanted to be. Would it remain a land where a few families built castles in cities? Or would it become something more democratic, more accessible, more fluid? The fall of the Vanderbilt Mansion offered an answer. The age of inherited empires, of social exclusivity and architectural arrogance, was being replaced by something else, more open, more commercial, more uncertain. The Gilded Age had ended not with a revolution, but with a wrecking ball. The end of the Gilded Age couldn't be understood without first tracing its spectacular rise. The grandeur of Fifth Avenue, the mansions, the balls, and the cultural dominance of America's elite all began with the industrial titans, men who turned steam, steel, and crude oil into unimaginable personal fortunes. They weren't just businessmen, they were nation shapers. In the aftermath of the Civil War, America stood at a crossroads. The Union had triumphed, but the nation was fractured, socially, physically, and economically. And into this vacuum surged ambition, innovation, and ruthless determination. In 1865, railroads were still fragmented, a tangle of incompatible lines that ended in rural stations and disconnected towns. But just 4 years later, in 1869, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad connected the East and West coasts for the first time. What had once taken 6 months by wagon could now be done in less than a week by train. It was a miracle of logistics. And behind it stood the towering figure of Cornelius, the Commodore Vanderbilt. He didn't build the railroads from scratch. He bought them, connected them, and made them efficient. He turned chaos into control. Vanderbilt understood that railroads were more than tracks and steel. They were arteries for the new economy. They moved coal, cattle, wheat, and people. He created one of the first true corporate empires in American history. By acquiring and consolidating railroad lines, Vanderbilt formed the New York Central System, connecting Manhattan to Chicago with a single logistical thread. His methods were sometimes brutal, buying competitors and crushing them with lower prices, manipulating stock prices, bribing legislators, but he got results. By the time he died in 1877, he was worth over $100 million more than any American had ever amassed. His fortune was a new kind of power, faster, more concentrated, and unapologetically capitalist. Yet railroads were just the beginning. Vanderbilt's steel tracks sparked a secondary revolution in the material that made those rails possible. Steel. Enter Andrew Carnegie, a Scottish immigrant who began as a telegraph boy and rose through the Pennsylvania railroad system. He was clever, ambitious, and relentlessly frugal. Carnegie realized that America's hunger for infrastructure, rails, bridges, skyscrapers, could only be fed by steel. And not just any steel, but steel made cheap, fast, and in vast quantities. He invested in new processes like the Bessemer method, reducing costs and increasing scale. But Carnegie's genius wasn't just technological, it was structural. He vertically integrated every part of the steel-making process. He bought the iron mines, the coal fields, the barges that moved raw materials across the Great Lakes, the rail lines that brought them to Pittsburgh, and the mills that forged them into beams. Every cent stayed in his empire. Every inefficiency was eliminated. The result was an industrial machine that could undercut any rival. By the 1880s, Carnegie Steel was producing more steel than all of Great Britain. His personal share made him one of the richest men on earth. Carnegie, like many industrialists, believed in his own myth. He wrote essays about the gospel of wealth, arguing that the rich had a moral obligation to give back to society. He funded libraries, universities, and peace foundations. But his philanthropy did not erase the fact that his fortune was built on the backs of underpaid workers, dangerous conditions, and ruthless anti-union tactics. He called himself a benefactor of mankind, yet his steel empire would fire on striking workers at Homestead. He symbolized the contradiction at the heart of the Gilded Age, a world where extreme wealth and moral righteousness lived side by side, never quite acknowledging their contradictions. If Vanderbilt was the builder of America's arteries and Carnegie its skeleton, then John D. Rockefeller was its blood. He refined the energy source that powered everything: oil. In the years following the Civil War, the need for kerosene to light homes exploded. Whale oil was expensive, candles were dim, but petroleum, properly refined, could light a room with clean brilliance. Rockefeller didn't drill for oil himself. He let others take that risk. Instead, he built the pipelines, the refineries, the rail connections, and the distribution systems. He was a tactician of consolidation. Standard Oil, founded in 1870, quickly became the most feared and powerful company in America. Rockefeller used every trick in the book, and some that weren't written yet. He negotiated secret discounts with railroads, sold kerosene below cost to bankrupt competitors, then bought them out for pennies. He created a trust system to conceal and control a massive network of independent companies. By the early 1880s, Standard Oil controlled more than 90% of American refining. It wasn't just a monopoly, it was an empire. And Rockefeller himself, he was a deeply religious man, a Baptist who taught Sunday school, gave dimes to children, and saw himself as chosen to manage God's wealth. But behind the kind eyes and grandfatherly image was a corporate killer. Ida Tarbell, whose father was destroyed by Standard Oil, would later expose Rockefeller's practices in the most famous piece of muckraking journalism ever written. The halo Rockefeller carefully crafted would never fully recover. These men, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Rockefeller, were not just rich. They were a new species of American royalty. Their wealth dwarfed anything seen before, and it came at a staggering human cost. There were no labor laws, no safety codes, no minimum wage, no workman's compensation. A man injured in a steel mill was simply replaced. Children worked 12-hour days in textile mills. Workers lived in crowded tenements while tycoons installed golden bathtubs in their summer homes. The gap between rich and poor wasn't just wide, it was incomprehensible. But the public didn't yet have the tools to fight back. The government, weak and often corrupt, did little to restrain monopolies. The press, frequently bought and paid for, praised the captains of industry. Churches spoke of wealth as divine reward. The few voices who did speak out, labor organizers, socialist pamphleteers, populist politicians, were dismissed as radicals or silenced outright. In that vacuum, the industrialists thrived. They saw themselves not as oppressors, but as the engines of American greatness. And in many ways, they were. They modernized the economy, built the cities, laid the foundation for a global superpower. But they also created a fragile world, one that depended on the silence of the poor and the complicity of the government. And when the noise came, the strikes, The lawsuits, the journalists, the taxes. They would find themselves unprepared for a world that no longer believed in their mythology. They had built the mansions, but would their children be able or willing to live in them? In the towering shadow of industrial titans and their fortunes, another kind of empire quietly took shape, one not measured in dollars, but in lineage, etiquette, and invitations. Money alone could buy land, railroads, and steel mills. But social power, the kind that granted entry to the highest echelons of society, was guarded like a fortress. In late 19th century New York, no one policed that fortress more fiercely than Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, known simply and imperiously as Mrs. Astor. She didn't build railroads. She built walls between old money and the arrivistas clawing their way up from commerce. And within those walls, she curated an American aristocracy as rigid and codified as any in Europe. Caroline was born into the old Dutch families of New York, the Schermerhorns, who had grown wealthy through real estate and respectable business long before railroads were even imagined. When she married into the Astor family, landed, powerful, and already legendary in the city, she stepped into the perfect position to preside over the growing chaos of New York's wealth explosion. By the 1870s, fortunes were appearing overnight. Oil barons, railroad men, and mining kings were buying up Fifth Avenue lots and commissioning elaborate homes. But wealth did not equal respectability. And to Caroline Astor, that distinction was essential. Society needed order. Without rules, anyone with a checkbook could claim nobility. And so, along with her self-appointed Chamberlain, Ward McAllister, Mrs. Astor established what came to be known as the 400, the number of individuals who could fit into the ballroom of her home at 350 Fifth Avenue. That figure, though never officially codified, became the symbolic cutoff for entry into New York's upper crust. The message was clear. Social space was finite, and she would decide who occupied it. For years, the Vanderbilts were pointedly excluded. Despite their immense fortune, over $100 million at one point, Mrs. Astor found them too new, too commercial, too vulgar. Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt had started life as a ferryboat operator, a man who dealt in coal smoke and labor strikes. Caroline believed true society could not be bought with freight profits or stock speculation. But the Vanderbilts were persistent. In 1883, Alva Vanderbilt, wife of William K. Vanderbilt, threw a masquerade ball that would become the stuff of legend. The house alone cost over $3 million to build. The ball cost another $250,000, over $7 million today. There were 200 guests in full costume, a grand staircase lit by gaslight and electric bulbs, and champagne that never stopped flowing. Alva invited Mrs. Astor, but held firm that she would not be admitted unless she had first called formally on the Vanderbilts. The standoff was a test of power. In the end, Mrs. Astor relented. Her daughter's social prospects were too valuable to risk. That single visit cracked the gate wide open, and the Vanderbilts entered high society at last. It was one of the few times in history that social power bent to wealth, rather than the other way around. The rituals of inclusion were elaborate and deeply symbolic. Calling cards were left with footmen and placed on silver trays. Ladies received visits on specific at-home days. Young women were formally presented to society in debutante balls, usually organized by a mother or aunt, to receive an invitation to Mrs. Astor's opera box, or to be seen in conversation with her at Newport. was a mark of ultimate acceptance. But these rituals were more than theater. They were enforcement mechanisms. They signaled who was in and who would never be. Within the 400, there were layers. Families with old money and old names. The Livingstons, the Rhinelanders, the Stuyvesants held the top positions. Below them were the successful but still scrutinized new money families like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, and even below that were the border families, those with enough fortune to cause curiosity, but not enough finesse to earn trust. Social failure could come from anything. Too much jewelry, the wrong kind of accent, a vulgar show of wealth, an off-color joke made in the wrong salon. Summer in Newport, Rhode Island, became the true battlefield of society. There, the great cottages were anything but modest. Sprawling mansions with names like the Breakers and Marble House, filled with French tapestries and Italian marble. Caroline Astor's own Newport home, Beechwood, served as her seasonal court. Parties followed a strict rhythm. Dinners at 8, dancing at 10, supper at midnight. Guests were expected to dress perfectly, speak French or Italian if needed, and never, ever discuss money in public. While the men of society still conducted business, the social calendar was largely dominated and orchestrated by women. These hostesses wielded enormous soft power. They could determine the rise of a family through strategic matchmaking or orchestrated scandal. They could destroy reputations with a whisper in the right ear. Beneath the glittering surface, it was a world driven by calculation and rivalry. Every ball invitation was a test, every introduction a negotiation. The children born into this class grew up with an iron sense of entitlement. From birth, they learned not just manners, but how to navigate hierarchy. Sons were expected to marry well and protect the family name. Daughters were trained for presentation, taught French, how to curtsy properly, and how to speak just enough but never too much. Everything, from their hairstyles to their opinions, was groomed for social display. And yet, beneath the polished veneer, cracks were forming. Some in the rising generation chafed at the rules. Others, seeing the disparity between their glittering world and the poverty just blocks away, began to question the morality of it all. Progressive ideas, labor rights, suffrage, taxation, were beginning to stir in the press and in parlor conversations. Even some heirs to these vast fortunes found themselves uncomfortable in roles assigned to them at birth. But during Mrs. Astor's reign, none of that mattered. She remained the Empress of New York society until her death in 1908. Even as she aged, forgetful and frail, her name still carried weight. After her passing, the cohesion she maintained began to unravel. No successor could command the same obedience. The social system she curated would linger into the 1910s and 1920s, but its authority would fade under the weight of war, reform, and economic change. Yet for one glittering generation, Mrs. Astor built an empire on etiquette, exclusivity, and spectacle. She turned dinner parties into declarations, dance cards into battlegrounds. She took the raw, hungry energy of American capitalism and dressed it in silk gloves and French perfume. And through sheer force of will, she convinced a nation with no nobility to pretend it had one. In the years following the Civil War, Fifth Avenue north of 50th Street was a stretch of tranquility, tree-lined, dotted with modest row houses and a scattering of vacant lots. The city's elite lived further downtown, around Washington Square and Gramercy Park, where brownstones projected refinement and restraint. But as the titans of industry grew richer, their ambitions grew louder. Soon, quiet Fifth Avenue would be transformed into the most ostentatious residential boulevard in America, a corridor of opulence so concentrated it earned nicknames like Millionaire's Row, Vanderbilt Alley, and the Gold Coast. The transformation began with William Henry Vanderbilt, the son of the Commodore. In 1879, flush with railroad wealth and hungry for legitimacy, he commissioned not just one mansion, but three, built side by side on Fifth Avenue and 51st Street, one for himself and the others for his two married daughters. The combined project cost nearly $2 million, a staggering sum at the time, and though still built in the once fashionable brownstone style, it sent a message. This wasn't just a home. It was a fortress of legacy, a new dynasty planting its standard on Manhattan's most coveted ground. But brownstone was already on its way out. The real fashionable material of the 1880s and 1890s was limestone, smooth, pale, and European. And the design language of the nouveau riche was the French chateau, the Italian palazzo, and the Renaissance hotel particulier. Nothing said old-world refinement, quite like importing at wholesale. American millionaires, newly rich and deeply insecure, weren't content with building mansions. They built fantasies, architectural stage sets that whispered of nobility and centuries-old bloodlines. The architect of this revolution was Richard Morris Hunt, the first American trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Hunt understood not just the technical details of European grandeur, but its theatrical power. In 1883, he designed a limestone palace for William K. Vanderbilt and his wife Alva at Fifth Avenue and 52nd Street. Its facade was carved with Gothic flourishes, gargoyles, and steep mansard roofs. Inside were tapestries from the Loire Valley, stained glass windows from European monasteries, and ceilings inspired by Versailles. The project cost over $3 million, with an additional $2 million spent on interiors. The house was nothing short of a statement. America could rival Europe on its own terms. That home sparked a frenzy. Within a decade, Fifth Avenue north of 50th Street became a marble and limestone runway of competition. If one family built at 52nd, another would push to 55th, 60th, 70th, 80th. Andrew Carnegie, ever the iconoclast, chose a quieter stretch at 91st Street. His house, finished in 1902, was simpler by comparison but no less grand. It occupied an entire city block, with 64 rooms, a private garden, and a sense of architectural restraint that only the supremely wealthy could afford. Carnegie believed in utility and design with purpose. His mansion featured modern innovations like steel framing, central heating, and an elevator. He may have disliked ostentation, but his house was still a monument to power. Others went in the opposite direction. Senator William Clark, a Montana copper magnate, spent 7 years and over $7 million building a mansion on 77th Street that defied imagination. It had 121 rooms, 4 art galleries, Turkish baths, and a private underground rail connection. Critics called it gaudy, grotesque, and worse. But Clark didn't care. He hadn't come to New York for subtlety. He came to carve his name into stone. As more mansions rose, the avenue began to resemble a corridor of feudal castles. Each tried to outdo its neighbor. Larger ballrooms, rarer woods, imported mantels, galleries that could house entire private museums. The social competition was ferocious and architectural. Families didn't just build homes, they built claims to cultural legitimacy. A 2-story library wasn't about books. It was about showing you could afford the time to pretend books mattered. These homes required enormous staffs. The houses themselves were machines of ceremony. Servants moved silently through back staircases, unseen unless summoned. The main floors, ballrooms, dining salons, drawing rooms, were stages on which elite families played out the performances of power. A home with 50 rooms might require 40 staff members. There were butlers, valets, ladies' maids, parlor maids, scullery maids, footmen, drivers, and gardeners. Some houses even had separate servants' libraries and recreation spaces, yet these workers remained invisible. The wealth on display was meant to look effortless. The expense was staggering. Beyond construction, there were taxes, coal deliveries, constant repairs, and wages. Mansions had no insulation, drafty windows, and hundreds of gas fixtures that needed tending. Wallpapers and textiles had to be updated to keep up with changing fashion. Marble cracked, French paneling warped. A single year of upkeep could cost the equivalent of millions today. But to fall behind was to lose status. No one wanted to be the family with last season's decor or a servant who'd been seen in public. Despite the parade of extravagance, these houses were not always happy homes. Many were built as weapons in social warfare. Daughters were married off to British aristocrats for titles. Sons were pushed into finance and politics. Marriages, often arranged for strategic gain, fractured behind closed doors. Wives who had fought for a place in society found themselves alone in echoing halls, watched over by servants who reported their every move. The very scale of the houses made intimacy nearly impossible. One could go days without encountering a family member. Tourists flocked to the avenue. On Sundays, middle-class families strolled past the high gates to marvel at the wealth on display. Newspapers published illustrations of interiors most would never see. For a brief time, Fifth Avenue was America's Versailles, an open-air museum of class division, a glittering reminder of who held the reins of power. But the land beneath those mansions was changing. The city was expanding. Commercial interests crept northward. Department stores, hotels, and office towers began to encroach. The same forces that had made Fifth Avenue desirable, centrality, prestige, visibility, made it irresistible to real estate developers. Property values soared, and taxes followed. The very thing that once represented permanence now began to look like dead weight. No one building these mansions in the 1890s imagined they would be gone within 40 years. They were built with the illusion of immortality. But by the 1920s, the first cracks had formed. What was once a world of stone and ceremony would soon face the wrecking ball. In the world of the Gilded Age elite, true power was never declared directly. It shimmered in candlelight, rustled in silk, and echoed in the clipped greetings exchanged over champagne. To walk into a Fifth Avenue ballroom during the height of the season was to enter a world that existed for the performance of dominance. The Gilded Age ball was not a party in the ordinary sense. It was an institution, meticulously planned, astronomically expensive, and designed to cement one's place in society's invisible hierarchy. These nights were pageantry, politics, and mating ritual wrapped into one glittering event. Receiving an invitation to one of these balls was a social triumph. They arrived weeks in advance, engraved on heavy cream-colored cardstock, often with gilt edges and hand-calligraphed names. Each carried not only logistical details, but a signal of favor. To be included meant you mattered. To be excluded was not just a slight. It was a social wound that might take years to heal, if it ever could. Hosts guarded their guest lists like national secrets. Entire family reputations hinged on who was, or wasn't, allowed through the door. Preparation was its own ritual. For women, it began days in advance. Dresses were custom-ordered, sometimes from Parisian designers, made from imported silks, satins, and tulle. A proper ball gown might cost as much as a working-class family earned in a year. The jewelry worn with it was often heirloom or custom-crafted, designed to catch the light from chandeliers and draw admiration or envy from across the room. Diamonds, emeralds, tiaras, and ropes of pearls turned necklines into declarations of lineage and wealth. Ladies' maids labored for hours on elaborate hairstyles, curling, pinning, and layering pieces of real and false hair into towering constructions that might rise 6 inches above the head. The goal was to project elegance, height, and grace, an illusion reinforced with posture training, rehearsed curtsies, and powdered skin. Men, by contrast, wore strict evening uniforms, black tailcoats, white waistcoats, and patent shoes. They were not to compete with the women, but to act as their refined counterparts. Status was indicated not by creativity, but by flawless execution of rules. As the appointed night arrived, the family carriage would draw up to the mansion under a canopy of canvas, stretched from curb to entrance. Red carpet lined the sidewalk. Footmen in livery stood at attention. Onlookers, barred by velvet ropes and watched by mounted police, gathered for the spectacle. These onlookers were not just curious. They were bearing witness to America's imitation of nobility, proof that democracy had its own version of monarchy. Inside, ballrooms were transformed into floral cathedrals. Hosts ordered thousands of cut flowers, roses, lilies, orchids, that would wilt within hours but live forever in the memory of those who inhaled their scent. Gaslight and early electric bulbs illuminated mirrored walls and gilt ceilings. Music began before the guests arrived, provided by a full orchestra hidden in a loft or gallery. Every detail was curated to impress. The champagne, the footman's gloves, the placement of art on the walls. Guests passed through a receiving line, formally announced by name. Here, every handshake mattered. A subtle hesitation could signal disapproval. A smile, however fleeting, could shift alliances. The ball, for all its laughter and dance, was serious business. Reputation could be won or ruined in an evening. Mothers maneuvered daughters into view of eligible bachelors. Fathers eyed potential in-laws across the room, calculating dowries and social advantage. Dancing began in order of marital status. First, the married couples, usually older, established, and somewhat ceremonial. Then the young married women, and finally, the true debutantes. Each young woman tracked how many dances she was offered and by whom. A full dance card was a badge of honor. Too many dances with the same man risked whispers of impropriety. Too few dances with any man marked her as undesirable. The stakes were high, the choreography exacting. Between dances, guests strolled through adjoining salons, studied tapestries, sipped punch, and whispered gossip. Every interaction was observed. Being seen in conversation with someone socially higher could lift a family's standing. Being caught in the wrong conversation could do the opposite. Even laughter was performative, charming, musical, never vulgar, and while the music soared, the real sound of the evening was the low murmur of strategy and self-preservation. Around midnight, supper was served, lavishly, not seated dining, but buffet-style arrangements that offered cold pheasant, oysters, lobster, roast meats, and every confection imaginable. Champagne flowed in rivers. The flowers alone at supper might cost $10,000. The food, another $20,000. These were not feasts, they were manifestos. They declared that the host had not only money, but the taste, refinement, and command over logistics to orchestrate beauty at scale. As the night wore on, the mood loosened. The champagne took effect. The music quickened. New European dances like the waltz, the two-step, and eventually the scandalous turkey trot made their appearances, to the horror of older guests and the delight of the younger. Laughter grew louder. Etiquette softened slightly. But still, the rules hovered. No scandal, no overindulgence. The performance had to continue until the final curtain. Some guests left after supper. Others stayed until 3 or 4 in the morning. The host and hostess, regardless of fatigue, remained until the last guest departed. Behind the scenes, servants immediately began cleaning. The flowers were tossed, the dishes washed by hand, carpets vacuumed. By sunrise, the only evidence of the spectacle might be a faint scent of perfume in the air and a few scuff marks on the marble floors. And yet, the ball did not truly end. The next morning, the newspapers recounted every detail. Who wore what? Who danced with whom? Who was seen whispering behind the staircase? These write-ups mattered. They were the public record of private power. For those rising in society, being mentioned in the society pages could open doors. For those absent or forgotten, the silence could be deafening. The ball, then, was not entertainment. It was theater. Every costume, every glance, every bouquet and canapé played a role in preserving a fragile social order. These events served as the proof that the Gilded Age elite had succeeded in building their own world, not just of wealth, but of ritual, elegance, and unquestioned supremacy. But underneath the silks and sonatas, the structure was already showing strain. The world outside the ballroom was changing. Laborers marched for fair wages. Immigrant families crowded into tenements just a few blocks away. A ball could delay that reality, but it could not banish it. For now, the chandeliers still sparkled. The orchestras still played. But somewhere beyond the velvet curtains, the music of a new America had begun to rise. Above the glimmering chandeliers and behind the gold-leaf doors of Fifth Avenue mansions, a separate world existed, one hidden in stairwells, kitchens, attics, and basement corridors. The Gilded Age elite lived in splendor. But that splendor was not self-sustaining. Beneath every ball, every elegant luncheon, and every spotless drawing room was a silent, invisible engine, the servant class. Without it, the lifestyle of the rich was not merely inconvenient, it was impossible. These grand homes required not dozens but sometimes scores of workers. A modest mansion with 40 rooms needed at least 25 full-time employees. Larger houses employed 50 to 70. The most lavish estates, like the Vanderbilt or Frick residences, could demand as many as 100 when entertaining. These workers functioned with the precision of a military operation, governed by hierarchy, discipline, and near-total anonymity. Their presence was vital, yet the ideal servant was never seen or heard unless summoned. At the top of the domestic pyramid stood the butler. He was not merely a server of meals, he was the master's representative, the household's memory, and its enforcer of etiquette. He supervised all male staff, oversaw the wine cellar, handled expensive silver, and coordinated formal events with military precision. His presence at the front door signaled stability and refinement. Below him was the housekeeper, who governed the female staff with equal authority. She managed the linens, supplies, daily schedules, and cleanliness of every visible surface. Together, these two figures kept the entire operation humming like a well-oiled machine. Specialized roles followed. Cooks, often French and paid more than many office workers. Kitchen maids, scullery maids, ladies' maids, valets, laundresses, grooms, and footmen. Each had a defined domain, a strict routine, and little time to rest. The lady's maid, for example, was more than a dresser. She managed wardrobes, styled hair, packed trunks for travel, cleaned delicate fabrics by hand, and anticipated every whim of her employer. Valets performed the same for men, pressing shirts, laying out clothes, assisting with shaving and personal grooming, all without comment or error. Footmen were chosen for height, handsomeness, and the ability to wear livery with elegance. They served at table, answered doors, and stood sentinel during major events. Their presence conveyed order and opulence. But behind the livery were long hours, aching feet, and a silent agreement to sacrifice personal ambition for stability. Maids woke before dawn, lit fires in frigid rooms, emptied chamber pots, hauled hot water upstairs for morning baths, all before the family stirred. Their day did not end until long after midnight if a dinner party was held. Most of these workers were young, female, and foreign-born. Irish and German immigrants dominated the early years. Later, Italians, Swedes, and Eastern Europeans filled the ranks. Some came through agencies, others arrived by word of mouth, carrying letters of reference from previous homes like passports. Many lived in the attic floors of these great houses, in plain rooms with shared baths and few belongings. Privacy was rare. Romance was forbidden. The rules were absolute. A relationship discovered between servants could lead to immediate dismissal. And yet, despite the conditions, many saw domestic service as a path to security. Room and board were included. Meals, often leftovers from lavish family feasts, were predictable. Uniforms were provided. For a young immigrant woman with little education and no family, service could offer not just survival, but a degree of safety. Wages were modest, $200 to $500 a year, but that income was often sent home to support entire households in Europe. For every footman polishing silver in Manhattan, there was a mother in Cork or Warsaw counting on his weekly envelope. Still, the disparities were stark. The same cook who labored for hours over lobster bisque might never taste it herself. A lady's maid might spend hours preparing jewels and gowns worth thousands while owning nothing of value herself. At balls, footmen stood motionless against the wall as mountains of food passed by. Scullery maids scrubbed the aftermath alone at 3 Salme, while music still played upstairs. The separation of worlds was so complete, so routine, that many in the upper class genuinely believed the system functioned naturally, that it had always been this way. But the reality was more fragile than they knew. Even in the Gilded Age, good help was increasingly hard to find. As industrialization progressed, young people discovered other options. Factory work paid less, but offered freedom. A shop girl could live in her own boarding house, wear fashionable clothes, and have evenings free. In contrast, Domestic service meant living under the employer's roof, always on call, always under scrutiny. Some workers began choosing liberty over security. Then came World War I, and the balance tipped dramatically. Young men left to fight. Women filled factory jobs and took pride in their work. Patriotic posters encouraged service in war industries, not parlors. Domestic service, once seen as a respectable position, came to feel regressive, tied to the old class system that was collapsing under the weight of war, taxes, and reform. By the 1920s, the shortage was critical. Mansions that once had 40 servants made do with 10. Families closed off entire wings of their homes. Footmen were replaced with part-time doormen. Butler pantries went quiet. Some households attempted to modernize, installing electric lifts, telephone systems, or servant bells to reduce the need for labor. But technology could not fully replace a staff trained in silence, speed, and deference. The servants, too, were changing. They no longer viewed the work as lifelong. They wanted days off, higher pay, respect. They left when mistreated. They sought education. Some joined early labor movements. Others started small businesses. The entire model, built on abundance of cheap, invisible labor, began to wobble. It was not an uprising, not a rebellion. It was a quiet exodus, one by one, out the service entrance and into the modern world. By the time the mansions began falling in the 1920s and 30s, many of the workers who had once polished those banisters and poured wine at those long tables were gone. They had faded into anonymity or risen into new lives as nurses, shop owners, seamstresses, or clerks. Their names rarely appeared in the society pages. Their stories were not engraved in marble, but they had made the Gilded Age possible. The irony was complete. The very people who had kept the engine running, who turned gas lamps, carried coals, scrubbed floors, and ironed gloves, were the ones who would quietly walk away and, by doing so, bring the whole glittering illusion to an end. In the towering mansions of Fifth Avenue, the Gilded Age elite wrapped themselves in velvet, gold leaf, and the illusion of nobility. But for all the grandeur they could purchase with their industrial fortunes, one thing they couldn't buy, at least not easily, was the one thing they envied most: legitimacy. To the old-world aristocracy of Europe, American millionaires were still crude newcomers. They had coal dust on their hands and the stench of commerce in their fortunes. And this gnawed at them. They had the money. They wanted the heritage. So they turned to the one currency Europe was willing to trade for cash: art. Starting in the 1870s, a great transatlantic transfer of culture began. American collectors descended on Europe's auction houses, private salons, and crumbling castles with blank checks. What they lacked in ancestry, they aimed to replace with provenance: old masters, medieval tapestries, Renaissance bronzes, and Chinese porcelain became the new tokens of class. Not because they were understood, but because they were venerated. If one couldn't be born into culture, perhaps one could buy it piece by piece. John Pierpont Morgan led the charge, a financier of staggering wealth and confidence. Morgan didn't just collect art, he amassed it. Entire rooms, entire collections, entire libraries passed into his hands. He bought directly from English aristocrats desperate for cash after a disastrous agricultural depression devastated their rural incomes. Paintings that had hung in the same family for centuries, Rembrandts, Rubenses, Vermeers, were suddenly up for sale. Morgan would circle half a dealer's catalog and write a check. Many of the works he purchased were crated and stored in warehouses. He never even saw them. Henry Clay Frick took a more focused approach. He didn't want everything. He wanted the best. His eyes were on the Dutch and Spanish masters. His house, built deliberately to become a museum after his death, featured walls designed for the precise dimensions of specific canvases. A Vermeer in one room, a Bellini in another. His collection wasn't merely decorative. It was meant to intimidate. To possess such works was to speak a new language of authority, one that transcended railroads and steel and entered the rarefied air of high culture. But the most flamboyant acquirer of European culture was William Randolph Hearst. His method was different, grander, more theatrical, and often surreal. Hearst didn't just buy paintings or sculptures. He bought entire rooms, ceilings, paneling, doors, fireplaces, ripped from medieval abbeys, French chateaux, and Spanish monasteries, were crated, shipped, and rebuilt in American buildings thousands of miles from their origin. He purchased so much that warehouses in New York overflowed with centuries of European craftsmanship waiting for a home. The dealers who facilitated these acquisitions became powerful figures in their own right. Foremost among them was Joseph Duveen, a British art dealer with impeccable manners, sharp instincts, and an even sharper tongue. Duveen understood what American millionaires wanted, not just art, but cultural transformation. He sold not only objects, but status. He was known for saying, "Europe has the art, America has the money." And he saw his mission as transferring the former to the latter. For a price. Duveen did more than sell masterpieces. He manufactured reputations. He championed certain artists, Rembrandt, Gainsborough, Velázquez, because their work could fetch astronomical sums. He trained collectors to recognize important pieces and to reject anything that didn't scream grandeur. He manipulated provenance, exaggerated histories, and sometimes even had restorers enhance artworks to make them more appealing. His clients didn't mind. What they craved was assurance that what they owned was priceless, and that others knew it. The frenzy escalated. In the 3 decades leading up to World War I, thousands of important works of European art crossed the Atlantic. The British press grew alarmed. French critics wept over their cultural losses. But aristocrats kept selling. The grandeur of their estates had become unsustainable. And in many cases, the proceeds from selling a Titian paid for desperately needed repairs to a leaky roof or the settlement of family debts. The Americans, flush with cash from railroads, oil, and steel, were happy to oblige. This cultural hunger wasn't purely superficial. Many American collectors did care deeply about the works they acquired. They studied art history, consulted scholars, and worked closely with curators. But there was also a more complicated truth. These collections were efforts at transformation. The industrialists didn't want to be remembered as robber barons. They wanted to be seen as patrons, as visionaries, as men who had elevated their country. Owning a Vermeer wasn't just about aesthetics. It was a declaration that one had arrived not just financially, but spiritually. The houses they built became temples to this ambition. The Frick Collection, the Morgan Library, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. These were not simply private homes. They were private mythologies made stone and canvas. To walk through them today is to experience an aesthetic constructed not just for pleasure, but for penance. The money used to purchase these treasures had been earned, in many cases, through brutal exploitation. The art was the attempt at redemption, but not everyone was convinced. European critics derided the cultural piracy of American buyers. Within the U.S., muckrakers pointed out the hypocrisy of men who underpaid workers while overpaying for Flemish altarpieces. And behind the admiration, there was always an undercurrent of doubt. Could culture truly be bought? Did hanging a Goya make one less vulgar, less culpable, more refined? Or was it simply a more expensive costume? World War I brought the spree to a halt. Europe had no time to sell culture. It was trying to survive. America, now a creditor nation, began to feel less inferior and more dominant. The urgency to mimic European taste diminished, and younger generations, raised among the masterpieces, often felt less attachment to them. Some sold, others donated. A few ignored them entirely. Still, the legacy of that great cultural transfer endures. Museums across the U.S. owe their foundations to Gilded Age buyers. The Met, the National Gallery, and countless university museums contain rooms full of canvases and objects once crated across oceans. For better or worse, the American industrial elite succeeded in their quest to transplant the cultural heart of Europe into the New World. And in doing so, they told a story, not just of wealth, but of longing, of men who could build rail empires, dominate oil markets, and shape the modern world, but who still felt incomplete, who looked across the Atlantic and saw not just castles and cathedrals, but a validation they couldn't find at home. And so they bought it, piece by piece, frame by frame, hoping that in the quiet glow of a Caravaggio, they might finally hear someone whisper, "You belong." For decades, the Gilded Age elite believed they could control their public image. They funded libraries and museums. Their names adorned universities, symphonies, hospitals. Their philanthropy made headlines. Their parties filled society columns. And their wealth was treated, if not always with reverence, then at least with reluctant admiration. But beginning in the early 20th century, a new force emerged that pierced the glittering armor of privilege: investigative journalism. The muckrakers, as they came to be known, didn't just challenge the Gilded Age. They unraveled it. The name itself came from President Theodore Roosevelt. In 1906, he derided journalists who rake the muck of society, focusing only on its filth. He intended it as criticism, but the writers embraced the label. After all, there was plenty of muck to rake. America's cities teemed with corruption. Factories operated with no safety regulations. Monopolies crushed competition. Tenement children died of diseases that could be cured with basic sanitation. The elite had wealth. The muckrakers had words. McClure's magazine became ground zero for this movement. Founded by S. McClure, it recognized a public hunger for stories that revealed how power truly worked. These weren't tabloids. They were meticulously researched exposés, written with literary flair and moral urgency. In 1902, the magazine released a triple blow that rocked the establishment. Lincoln Steffens began publishing The Shame of the Cities, exposing political graft from Philadelphia to St. Louis. Ray Stannard Baker reported on labor exploitation and racial inequality. And then came Ida Tarbell. Her target was Standard Oil. Her weapon was truth. Tarbell was no outsider. Her father had been driven out of business by the very empire she would dissect. Over years, she compiled documents, conducted interviews, and followed paper trails to unearth exactly how John D. Rockefeller had built his monopoly. Her serialized account revealed secret deals with railroads, predatory pricing, and the strategic crushing of independent refiners. She didn't accuse, she proved. When the history of the Standard Oil Company was published as a book in 1904, it became a sensation. Tarbell's calm, clinical style made her findings all the more devastating. She showed how Rockefeller had manipulated markets, bribed politicians, and used his vast wealth to maintain power. He had built Standard Oil not on innovation, but on domination. The American public, who had once viewed him as a symbol of industrial success, began to see him as something else, a predator in a suit. Rockefeller attempted damage control. He pointed to his donations, his endowments, the universities and hospitals his money supported. But as one editorial bluntly put it, "You cannot bleach a black deed by writing your name on a library." The idea that wealth could cleanse itself through generosity no longer held. The source of the fortune now mattered as much as how it was spent. The floodgates opened. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, a novel, but based on deep research, exposed the horrors of the meatpacking industry. Workers lost limbs. Rats fell into grinding vats. Spoiled meat was masked with chemicals and shipped to stores. The public reacted with outrage, not just for the workers, but for themselves. Roosevelt, reading it in one sitting, ordered investigations. The result? The Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. Sinclair famously remarked, "I aimed at the public's heart and hit it in the stomach." David Graham Phillips followed with The Treason of the Senate, a scorching series that revealed how industrialists effectively owned American senators. He named names. He printed bank records. He mapped the flow of money from trusts to politicians. The Senate, he showed, was less a deliberative body and more a boardroom. The reaction was swift. Public confidence in Congress plummeted, and momentum grew for direct election of senators, which became law with the 17th Amendment in 1913. The elite were stunned. For decades, they had written their own mythology of genius, benevolence, and destiny. Now, that narrative was being rewritten in real time, and not by them. For every ball covered in the society pages, there was now a headline about a breadline. For every library built, an article about laborers who died building it. Public relations emerged as a new industry. Ivy Lee, one of the first PR professionals, was hired to manage the Rockefeller family's image. He staged photo ops, encouraged interviews, and tried to humanize the dynasty. John D. Rockefeller was photographed handing out dimes to children, a gesture that became both iconic and widely mocked. It wasn't enough. The genie was out of the bottle. The public had seen behind the curtain. For the elite, the psychological blow was profound. They had seen themselves as captains of industry, building a nation. Now they were cast as villains. The term robber baron moved from editorial insult to common usage. The muckrakers didn't just attack the individuals, they attacked the system. The idea that unregulated capitalism naturally produced greatness was now suspect. Monopolies were no longer admired. They were feared. The journalism also inspired action. New regulatory bodies were formed. The Federal Trade Commission, the Interstate Commerce Commission gained new powers. Antitrust cases were brought against the largest conglomerates. Standard Oil was broken up in 1911. The muckrakers had helped make that possible, not through riots, but through narrative. More importantly, they changed how Americans thought about power. Wealth, once synonymous with virtue, now came with suspicion. Citizens began to ask, who suffers when someone gets rich? Whose labor builds this fortune? Whose voices are silenced so others may speak? These questions would not go away. Not all the elite resisted the scrutiny. Some adapted. Some shifted to quieter lives. But others doubled down, funding conservative newspapers, attacking reformers, warning of socialism. The country was splitting, not just economically, but morally. The age of blind reverence had ended. A new age of accountability had begun. The muckrakers were not perfect. Some were sensationalist, others lacked nuance, but they served a vital function. They gave the voiceless a megaphone. They dragged hidden abuses into the sunlight. They reminded a nation that democracy demands transparency, and in doing so, they did something extraordinary. They made the richest men in America afraid, not of rivals, not of markets, but of the truth. For decades, workers had endured. They'd labored in unsafe factories, on sweltering rail lines, in soot-choked mines, paid pennies while the men at the top became legends. They watched mansions rise as their own families crammed into cold tenements. They toiled in silence because there was no alternative. If you refused, you starved. If you complained, you were fired. But patience, like coal, burns hot before it turns to ash. And by the 1890s, America's working class had reached its breaking point. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 marked the beginning. When the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad slashed wages for the third time in a year, workers walked off the job. What began in West Virginia spread like wildfire. Trains halted in Maryland, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois. Stations were attacked. Rail yards set ablaze. Militia units were called in. In Pittsburgh, soldiers opened fire on strikers, killing more than 20. Rioters responded by torching the yards, destroying locomotives and freight cars in a storm of smoke and fury. The violence shocked the nation. For the first time, capitalists saw that their control wasn't absolute. Their empires depended on obedience, and obedience was no longer guaranteed. The strikes continued. In 1886, workers in Chicago rallied for an 8-hour workday. The peaceful demonstration in Haymarket Square turned deadly when someone threw a bomb at police. Chaos erupted. Shots were fired. 7 officers died, along with several protesters. Though the bomber was never identified, 8 anarchists were arrested. 4 were hanged. The incident sparked panic among the elite. If workers were planting bombs in city centers, what would they do next? Every laborer became a potential threat. Every picket line, a battlefield. One of the bloodiest chapters came at Homestead in 1892. Andrew Carnegie's steel plant in Pennsylvania was the site of a brutal confrontation. When workers protested wage cuts, Carnegie's partner, Henry Clay Frick, hired 300 Pinkerton agents to break the strike. Armed with rifles and batons, the Pinkertons tried to land by barge under cover of darkness. Workers met them with gunfire. A day-long battle ensued. 10 men died. Dozens were injured. Eventually, the state militia intervened. The strike was broken. The union was shattered. But public opinion turned sharply against Carnegie. The man who preached philanthropy had authorized a massacre. In 1894, the Pullman strike paralyzed the nation. The Pullman Company, which built luxury railcars, cut wages but refused to reduce rents in its company-owned housing. Workers appealed to Eugene V, Debs, and the American Railway Union. In solidarity, rail workers across the country refused to handle Pullman cars. Trains stopped, mail piled up, commerce froze. President Grover Cleveland, bowing to pressure from industrialists, sent federal troops to crush the strike. Debs was arrested. The strike failed, but it left a lesson. Labor had the power to disrupt, even if not yet the power to win. These weren't isolated outbursts. They were symptoms of a larger disease. The Gilded Age had produced immense fortunes by squeezing every drop from labor. 12-hour shifts, 6-day weeks, no pensions, no safety standards. Injured workers were discarded. Children were sent into coal mines before they could read. The elite dined beneath crystal chandeliers while workers died for lack of clean drinking water. The contrast was no longer tolerable, but violence alone wouldn't change the system. What did was politics. As progressive reformers gained traction, so did the idea that the government could and should intervene. At the heart of this new vision was a radical proposal: tax the rich. For generations, America had no income tax. The wealthy paid property taxes and little else. Tariffs on goods were regressive, burdening the poor more than the rich. In 1894, Congress passed a modest income tax, only to have it struck down by the Supreme Court. The message was clear. The Constitution protected capital more than citizens. But the movement didn't die. It grew stronger. By the early 1900s, fueled by labor unrest and muckraking journalism, public pressure mounted. The result was the 16th Amendment. Ratified in 1913, it gave Congress the power to levy income taxes without apportionment among the states. It was a quiet revolution. For the first time, the federal government could reach directly into the pockets of America's wealthiest citizens. The first tax rates were low, 1% on income over $3,000, rising to 7% on income over $500,000. But even this modest intrusion was met with outrage from the elite. Editorials denounced it as tyranny. Tycoons warned it would destroy investment. Private clubs buzzed with tax avoidance schemes. Accountants and lawyers found a new gold mine, helping the rich hide their money. Then came World War I, and everything changed. The government needed money, lots of it. Income taxes soared. By 1918, the top rate reached 77%. Suddenly, fortunes that had gone untaxed for generations were shrinking. The great Gilded Age estates, built on untouchable wealth, began to feel the pinch. Estate taxes followed. When a patriarch died, the government claimed a portion before heirs received a cent. This was not just economic policy, it was ideological. America was beginning to challenge the notion that wealth should pass unbroken from father to son. Generation after generation, the state now had a role in shaping outcomes. The invisible hand was no longer alone. The elite adapted. They created trusts. They funded foundations. They moved assets offshore. But the landscape had shifted. Money was no longer invincible. The rules had changed. For working people, the shift was bittersweet. They still struggled. Wages remained low. But the knowledge that the rich were finally being asked to contribute, finally being forced to pay their share, offered a flicker of justice. The strikes didn't stop. The coal miners, the textile workers, the steel laborers, they continued to fight. But they no longer fought alone. Public sentiment had shifted. Progressive politicians were listening. Courts were no longer automatic tools of repression. Something had cracked. The Gilded Age wasn't dead yet, but it was bleeding. When war erupted in Europe in the summer of 1914, it was a foreign drama to most Americans. The assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo seemed a distant echo, but the First Global War would soon reach into every corner of American life, and in doing so, would destroy not just nations, but an entire worldview. The Gilded Age, with its illusions of permanence and hierarchy, could not survive the realities of machine guns, gas warfare, and total mobilization. The war did not just end aristocracy in Europe. It pulled the rug out from under its American imitators. For decades, American elites had looked to Europe for validation. They modeled their houses after French chateaux, decorated them with Italian frescoes, and sent their daughters to marry British dukes. The structure of Fifth Avenue society, with its ballrooms, debutantes, and rigid social codes, was little more than an ocean-crossing mimicry of European nobility. But Europe's aristocracy did not survive the trenches of France. British lords who once strolled across manicured estates now led infantry charges across barbed wire fields. German princes fell at the Somme. French counts disappeared into the mud of Verdun. Entire noble houses lost their male heirs. The glamour of centuries-old lineage meant nothing against shrapnel and chlorine gas. The very ideals that America's rich had built their world upon, refinement, breeding, superiority, were annihilated by the industrial slaughter of World War I. American society watched closely, and it absorbed the lesson. If titles could not protect the British nobility, what then did a limestone palace in Manhattan mean? The illusion of permanence had cracked. Suddenly, Gilded Age mansions didn't look timeless. They looked fragile. Equally shattering was the role government played in wartime economies. To meet the demands of total war, states took control of industry in ways previously thought unimaginable. Governments rationed fuel, fixed prices, seized railroads, dictated production schedules. Capitalism didn't collapse, but it was temporarily suspended. The invisible hand was set aside. In its place, the very governments that elites had once feared for their interference now directed every major sector. In America, this meant massive federal spending and massive taxation. The income tax, freshly passed in 1913, exploded. In 1914, the federal government collected $37 million in income taxes. By 1918, it was collecting nearly $1 billion. The top tax rate reached 77%. Suddenly, the fortunes of the Vanderbilts, Fricks, Morgans, and Rockefellers were no longer sacrosanct. Their money was subject to the needs of a larger system. For families used to being above government scrutiny, the shift was seismic. The war also unleashed an unprecedented shift in labor and gender roles. With millions of men drafted into military service, women entered the workforce in numbers never before seen. They became clerks, machinists, telegraph operators, factory workers. For the first time, the elegant mistresses of Fifth Avenue watched as their parlor maids and chambermaids left for better-paying work in munitions plants. Domestic service, once a steady if stifling occupation, now seemed outdated, servile, even shameful. A woman could earn twice as much making artillery shells than folding table linens. The impact on Gilded Age households was profound. The grand homes had been built with the assumption that labor would always be cheap and abundant. But after the war, Help was scarce. Wages rose. Expectations shifted. Servants demanded time off, decent accommodations, and fair treatment. Many wealthy families could no longer staff their homes. Some shut down entire wings. Others abandoned city life altogether in favor of more manageable country estates. A few tried replacing people with technology, electric elevators, vacuum cleaners, buzzer systems. But the shift was irreversible. The age of the servant class was ending, and with it, the architectural and social system it supported. Social norms shifted as well. Lavish parties now felt grotesque against the backdrop of war widows and wounded veterans. Patriotic propaganda urged thrift, sacrifice, and simplicity. Extravagance became a public relations liability. Society events continued, but more subdued. Velvet was replaced with wool. Balls gave way to charity functions. The tone had changed, and those who failed to adapt found themselves the subject of withering criticism. Among the returning soldiers, a quiet rebellion brewed. They had seen the worst the world had to offer: mud, blood, death, and came back with no patience for gilded rituals and inherited privilege. Many veterans became activists. Some joined the labor movement. Others embraced socialism, pacifism, or new religious movements. They no longer believed in the elite's right to rule. They had fought for democracy abroad. Now they wanted it at home. In 1917, the Russian Revolution terrified America's upper class. Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown. Aristocrats were exiled, imprisoned, executed, their wealth seized, their estates looted. It wasn't just the fall of a dynasty, it was the obliteration of a social order. American newspapers printed stories of grand duchesses hiding in basements, of Bolsheviks dining under crystal chandeliers they'd smashed the day before. The unthinkable had happened. If it could happen in St. Petersburg, could it happen on Fifth Avenue? The elite reacted with fear and suppression. Labor strikes were labeled Bolshevik plots. Red Scare hysteria gripped the nation. But the fear masked a deeper truth. The world that had once applauded the elite's excess now questioned it. The old answers no longer satisfied. Internationally, America's role had changed too. No longer the cultural inferior begging for European acceptance. The U emerged from World War I as the world's financial leader. European countries owed it billions. The flow of prestige had reversed. American confidence surged. The need to imitate vanished. American culture began to define itself on its own terms. In music, literature, fashion, and film, jazz replaced waltzes, skyscrapers replaced palaces. The war did not demolish the Gilded Age physically, but it unraveled its mythology. It showed that society could change overnight, that government could direct markets, that workers could become soldiers, and servants could become free, that titles could die in trenches and mansions could stand empty. By the time the guns fell silent in November 1918, the world had been reordered. The palatial homes of the Gilded Age still stood, but their meaning had changed. They no longer represented triumph. They had become relics, symbols of a world that believed itself eternal and discovered, through war, just how quickly eternity ends. When Cornelius Vanderbilt II died in 1899, his family mourned the loss of a man who had once commanded the greatest fortune in America. But by the time his grandson, Cornelius Vanderbilt III, inherited the Grand Manhattan Mansion At Fifth Avenue and 57th Street in 1926, the mood had changed. It was no longer a symbol of triumph. It was a burden. The largest private home in New York City, with 130 rooms, soaring ceilings, ornate carvings, and imported marble, had become a gilded coffin, silently waiting to be emptied. The house had cost over $3 million to build in the 1880s, equivalent to more than $90 million today. But by the 1920s, it cost more to maintain than any member of the family was willing to pay. Property taxes alone reached $30,000 per year. Heating the drafty halls, lighting the endless corridors, repairing the slate roof, and paying even a skeleton crew of servants pushed the carrying costs well past $100,000 annually. And that didn't include the cost of truly living in it, of entertaining, maintaining appearances, and upholding the rituals that the house itself demanded. That would have doubled or tripled the cost. The younger Vanderbilts had different priorities. They had grown up among privilege, but they no longer needed castles to prove it. Apartments on Park Avenue were more efficient, easier to maintain, closer to the rhythm of the new Manhattan. Country estates provided the quiet luxury that urban palaces could not. The very idea of living in a single-family home that required a team of butlers, maids, and footmen had begun to feel more like aristocratic cosplay than a functional lifestyle. So the heirs did what would have been unthinkable just a generation before. They sold. But they didn't sell to another family looking to move into the mansion. They sold the land to a department store. Bergdorf Goodman saw the potential, not in the building, but in its footprint. Fifth Avenue was no longer a corridor of carriages and calling cards. It had become a commercial artery, buzzing with shoppers, taxis, and neon signs. The house that once stood as a monument to Gilded Age dominance was torn down, its bones salvaged or discarded, its history carted away in pieces. Cornelius Vanderbilt III wasn't alone. Up and down the avenue, heirs of America's founding fortunes came to similar conclusions. Andrew Carnegie's mansion was sold by his widow just 27 years after it was built. The Astor mansions fell. The Havemeyer house, the Clark mansion, all gone. Many were demolished less than a generation after their completion. Fortresses built to last centuries, falling before they even reached middle age. This wave of demolitions wasn't caused by bankruptcy. Most of these families remained wealthy by any standard, but they were no longer as rich as they had been. Or rather, the cost of displaying wealth had risen faster than their ability to sustain it. The tax code had changed everything. The income tax, first modest in 1913, had exploded during World War I. At its peak, the top bracket hit 77%. Though it dipped in the 1920s, the idea that the government had a right to claim a portion of private wealth was now embedded in law. Estate taxes added another blow. Previously, fortunes passed relatively untouched from generation to generation. Now, a death triggered an automatic extraction by the state. Even the most careful trusts and shelters couldn't fully shield large estates. Each generation lost a little more. Wealth still flowed, but it trickled instead of surged. And then there was labor. The loyal, lifelong staff that once ran these mansions had vanished. Maids had become shopgirls. Butlers had found work in banks or hotels. Footmen no longer saw the future in white gloves and liveried coats. The social contract had shifted. Those who might have once served were now citizens demanding agency. The supply of labor shrank while wages rose. Maintaining a 50-room house required not only money, but a workforce that no longer existed. Some families tried to adapt. They closed off entire floors. They installed modern plumbing and heating systems. They lived in just a few rooms and let the others go cold. But even these compromises couldn't prevent decay. The sheer size of the buildings, the complexity of the materials, the cost of upkeep, all conspired to make survival nearly impossible. Others attempted to repurpose their homes. They proposed converting mansions into clubs, offices, or apartment buildings. But the structures weren't designed for change. Ballrooms couldn't be divided easily into rental units. Kitchens were too distant from the living quarters. Staircases were grand, not functional. Retrofitting a Gilded Age mansion often cost more than tearing it down and starting fresh, so most of them fell. Demolition crews moved in with sledgehammers and wrecking balls. Carved limestone was reduced to rubble. Gold leaf ceilings collapsed in clouds of dust. Some families salvaged pieces, mantels, doors, stained glass windows to be used in new, smaller homes. Others donated fragments to museums. But for most, the buildings simply disappeared. The public watched with mixed feelings. Some mourned the architectural loss. Others cheered the fall of excess. Preservation wasn't yet a movement. The idea that these homes were part of the nation's cultural fabric had not taken root. They were seen as outdated, impractical, extravagant. Their destruction felt, in many circles, like progress. To the families themselves, the emotional toll was harder to measure. These were not just houses. They were legacies. They had been built as symbols of permanence, of dynasty. Their fall was not just an economic decision. It was an admission of defeat, a recognition that the world had changed, and that they could not stand outside it forever. And yet, in many cases, the heirs were relieved. They had no desire to live like dukes in a world of elevators and automobiles. The Gilded Age had been their grandparents' fantasy, not theirs. They preferred co-ops to ballrooms, country clubs to salons. In letting go of the mansions, they let go of the burdens they represented. The final irony was this: the children of the Gilded Age had become the wrecking crew. They did not swing the hammers themselves, but they signed the papers. They watched as walls came down and skylines changed. They presided over the funeral of a world their ancestors had built and chose not to rebuild it. By the 1920s and 1930s, the wrecking ball had become a familiar sight on Fifth Avenue, where once limestone palaces towered with confidence and carved stone facades glittered in the sunlight. Scaffolding now rose like gallows. The demolition of the Vanderbilt Mansion was not an anomaly. It was a signal. The Gilded Age, that glittering moment of unbridled wealth and excess, had become outdated, burdensome, and increasingly out of place in a rapidly modernizing city. The skyline of aristocracy was being torn down and replaced, not with more grandeur, but with commerce and modern convenience. Art Deco began to rise where Beaux-Arts once reigned. Streamlined facades replaced ornate carvings. Flat roofs replaced pitched gables. Geometric motifs took the place of floral stonework. The new buildings were not trying to imitate Europe. They were distinctly American, proudly modern, efficient, and profitable. Fifth Avenue, once reserved for society's 400, became the domain of thousands. Where a single family once held court in a mansion, now hundreds shopped, worked, and dined in towering structures of steel and glass. Bergdorf Goodman, the luxury department store that replaced the Vanderbilt Mansion, became a symbol of this shift. Its clean lines and expansive display windows welcomed all who had the money to buy. No need for a calling card. No need for family pedigree. Anyone could enter, browse, and participate in the experience of modern luxury. It wasn't about exclusivity anymore. It was about access. The street that had once been a stage for social competition had become a corridor of commerce. Apartment buildings soon replaced the remaining mansions. Residences like 740 Park Avenue offered luxury, but of a different kind. Instead of 40-room mansions staffed by dozens, these buildings provided elegant apartments with shared services, doormen, elevators, centralized maintenance. Families that once lived alone in a palace now shared lobbies with neighbors. Privacy still existed, but it was contained within smaller, more manageable spaces. The vertical city was born. These buildings were practical. The land they stood on generated revenue through rent. The costs of staff were shared. Taxes were manageable. The economics made sense. And they offered something the mansions could not: flexibility. You didn't need to hire a butler to open your front door. You didn't need to worry about a leaking roof 3 floors above. You didn't need to heat 20 rooms to use 2. The age of private palaces was over. And yet, not everything disappeared. Some Gilded Age buildings were saved, not because they were too beloved to destroy, but because they were transformed. Henry Clay Frick's mansion became the Frick Collection, just as he had intended. When his widow passed away in 1931, the home and its priceless contents were opened to the public. Visitors who once would have been barred at the door could now stroll through its halls, admire Rembrandts, and walk the same parquet floors once reserved for high society. The Frick was not just a museum. It was a preserved world, a time capsule. Everything remained in place. The furniture, the rugs, the arrangement of paintings. Walking through its rooms felt like stepping into the past. A reminder that these spaces had once been alive with whispered gossip, the clink of glass, and the rustle of silk. Now, instead of serving cocktails, the rooms served memory. The Morgan Library took a similar path, originally built as J.P. Morgan's private repository for rare books and manuscripts. It was transformed into a public institution by his son. The doors that once opened only for the elite now welcomed scholars and tourists alike. The vast reading room, with its celestial ceiling and leather-bound volumes, remained a sanctuary, but now one for curiosity, not power. Other mansions became clubs or schools. The University Club, the Metropolitan Club, and similar institutions purchased former homes and preserved their architecture. In some cases, the transformation was seamless. In others, it was awkward, with ballrooms turned into dining halls and galleries into meeting rooms. Still, they survived. Newport, Rhode Island, fared slightly better. The summer cottages of America's wealthiest families, many larger than most European palaces, survived longer, largely because they were used seasonally and cost less to maintain year-round. Eventually, organizations like the Preservation Society of Newport County stepped in. Today, visitors can walk through the Breakers, Marble House, and Rosecliff. They can imagine the ocean breezes drifting through open windows during lavish summer balls, even as they now shuffle through with audio guides in hand. But these were the exceptions. Most Gilded Age mansions did not survive. They were torn down without ceremony, their ruins carted off in dump trucks, their marble columns ground to dust. Their art, if not already removed, was scattered. A few fragments live on in museum exhibits. Mantels, balustrades, gilded mirrors. The rest is gone. Even photographs are rare. These homes existed for so short a time that few thought to document them thoroughly. Many families didn't preserve blueprints or inventories. After all, they had been built to last forever. The physical erasure was matched by a cultural one. New York remade itself. The values that had justified these homes, conspicuous consumption, inherited power, aristocratic pretense, were not just gone. They were mocked. The Great Depression would soon arrive, and with it, a wave of populist anger that would make even surviving symbols of the Gilded Age targets of scorn. By then, even the wealthiest Americans were looking for humility, or at least the appearance of it. The skyscrapers that replaced the mansions told a different story. They were monuments, too, but of commerce, not family. They symbolized business, ambition, and American efficiency. The Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building, Rockefeller Center. These structures defined the modern city. They didn't hide behind hedges. They reached into the sky, and they weren't designed for the few. They were built for the many. For workers, tenants, tourists, for the people. In that way, the demolition of the Gilded Age wasn't just architectural, it was philosophical. A society had shifted from the private to the public, from exclusivity to accessibility, from legacy to liquidity. The walls came down not because they were weak, but because the world around them had changed its mind about what mattered. Amid the wave of destruction that swept away the Gilded Age mansions of Fifth Avenue, a few survivors remained, ghosts of an era that had all but vanished, preserved not because the world still needed them, but because they found a new reason to exist. These were not homes anymore. They were institutions, and they survived because they transformed. The most famous example is the Frick Collection, designed from the start with a dual purpose, to serve as a home in life and a museum in death. Henry Clay Frick's mansion was built with permanence in mind. When Frick died in 1919, he left his house and its priceless contents to the public, along with an endowment to ensure its preservation. His widow, Adelaide, lived there until 1931, after which the doors opened to visitors. The museum that emerged wasn't just a display of art. It was a preserved experience of how the Gilded Age elite lived, surrounded by velvet, mahogany, and masterpieces. The decision to preserve the house as a museum was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it solved the problem of what to do with a massive, custom-built mansion that was difficult to sell or adapt. Symbolically, it reframed Frick's legacy. Instead of being remembered solely as the man who crushed steel strikes and underpaid workers, he became a patron of the arts, a steward of culture. This transformation allowed the public to walk the same halls as the once inaccessible elite, turning privilege into shared history. The Morgan Library underwent a similar journey. Originally a private retreat where financier J. P. Morgan housed his rare books, illuminated manuscripts, and Renaissance artifacts, it was transformed into a public institution by his son. In 1924, the Morgan family opened its library to scholars and visitors. The room, designed by architect Charles McKim, remains almost untouched, a temple to opulence and intellect, with walls lined in leather-bound volumes and ceilings painted with celestial scenes. These institutions worked because they offered more than nostalgia. They provided cultural value, educational purpose, and public benefit. They became places of learning and appreciation, not just preservation. They took what had once served a few and reimagined it for the many. Other mansions found second lives as clubs, the University Club and the Metropolitan Club, both founded by members of the upper crust, bought or commissioned buildings in the Gilded Age style. These clubs preserved architectural grandeur and the social networks that once ruled the city. They offered exclusivity still, but in new forms, open not to families, but to members. In many cases, their continued operation helped save buildings that might otherwise have been demolished. A few homes were adapted into schools or cultural centers. The mansion that now houses the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum was once Andrew Carnegie's residence. Its transformation into a design museum allowed it to endure while educating future generations about the very aesthetics that once defined elite life. Other buildings became embassies, foundations, or religious institutions. In each case, survival depended on utility. If a mansion could serve a new purpose, it had a chance. If not, it vanished. Newport, Rhode Island, preserved more of its Gilded Age heritage than any other American city. There, the summer cottages of America's richest families escaped demolition thanks to their seasonal use and growing historical interest. In the 1940s and 50s, as Fifth Avenue was being leveled, preservationists in Newport began acquiring and restoring these properties. The Preservation Society of Newport County was founded to save them, not just as homes, but as historical documents. The Breakers. Once the Vanderbilt summer home, is the crown jewel of Newport's Gilded Age Trail. With 70 rooms and Italian Renaissance details, it stands today as a museum open to the public. Visitors can walk through its massive dining room, glimpse the servant corridors, and imagine the rhythm of a season defined by balls, ocean breezes, and ostentatious leisure. Preservation came late to New York. By the time the city began to take the concept seriously in the 1960s, most of the great Gilded Age homes were already gone. The Landmarks Preservation Commission was created in 1965 after the destruction of Pennsylvania Station, a modern tragedy that galvanized public opinion. But it was too late to save the mansions of Fifth Avenue. What was left were fragments, architectural salvage, memories, and museums, and yet, the survivors tell us something essential about the past. Not just about how people lived, but about how they imagined their lives should look. They tell us about aspiration, identity, and the fragility of legacy. The buildings that endured did so not because they resisted change, but because they adapted to it. They allowed themselves to be reinterpreted. Today, standing in the music room of the Frick or the reading room of the Morgan, one can feel the tension between permanence and reinvention. The oil paintings still hang, but the meaning has shifted. The velvet ropes are not barriers of class now, but tools of preservation. The hush in the galleries is no longer fear of judgment, but respect for history. Ironically, by opening their doors to the public, these former fortresses of exclusivity found a kind of immortality. They became more than private retreats. They became civic treasures. And in doing so, they outlasted the very society that built them. By the mid-20th century, the Gilded Age had become a myth. Its names, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Rockefeller, were still spoken, etched into libraries, hospitals, and street signs. But the world they had built had vanished. Their marble mansions were gone. their social rituals dissolved, their family trees scattered. All that remained were museum wings, rusting gates in forgotten gardens, and photographs of grandeur now reduced to rubble. And yet, in that ruin, something enduring had taken root, a legacy not of wealth, but of consequence. The Gilded Age was never just about wealth. It was about the performance of permanence, the belief that status, once achieved, could be inherited and preserved like art or land. That illusion was powerful, but it proved false. Time dismantled it, not with revolution, but with economics, legislation, and changing values. And in that quiet dismantling lies one of the period's greatest lessons. Permanence is not guaranteed, even to those who build palaces. What the Gilded Age revealed, brilliantly, and sometimes brutally, was how wealth shapes culture, cities, and memory. It showed how fortunes can construct entire neighborhoods, fund global art markets, define fashion, and even mimic aristocracy. But it also exposed how fragile such structures are when built without roots in equity or adaptability. The mansions were massive, but their foundations, socially, economically, morally, were brittle. All it took was pressure from below and erosion from above for them to fall, and fall they did, not in a fiery collapse, but in orderly, transactional demolition. They were sold, deconstructed, carted off, not because they were hated, but because they no longer made sense. Their value had shifted from presence to memory, from dominance to symbolism. This, too, is a lesson. Grandeur alone is not enough to justify survival. The era also forces us to confront the ethics of legacy. The very wealth that funded museums and libraries also came from exploited labor, environmental damage, and monopolistic control. Should we revere the generosity of men like Carnegie, who built thousands of libraries, while acknowledging that his steelworkers labored in dangerous conditions for minimal pay? Should we marvel at Frick's Rembrandts without forgetting Homestead? The answer, perhaps, is not either or, but both. To understand the Gilded Age fully is to hold its contradictions in tension, to appreciate its ambition while interrogating its costs, to admire its art while questioning the means by which it was acquired. History rarely offers clean lines. The Gilded Age is no exception. Its legacy lives on not only in art museums and marble staircases, but in the very structure of American capitalism. Many of today's debates about wealth inequality, taxation, labor rights, and the role of government have roots in that period. The 1% of today would feel very familiar to the 400 of Caroline Astor's time. And just like then, the tension between privilege and progress simmers beneath the surface of American life. The architectural loss of the Gilded Age is also instructive. In their time, the mansions seemed eternal. Their destruction now stands as a warning that even the most lavish creations can disappear if they fail to adapt or serve a greater purpose. That beauty and opulence, without meaning or accessibility, will be swept away by changing values and practical needs. But the era also left behind unexpected gifts. By trying to imitate aristocracy, the Gilded Age inadvertently democratized high culture. It brought old masters to American shores, funded universities, filled libraries with books, and launched a national conversation about fairness and wealth. It created museums from mansions. Its ruin gave rise to preservation. Its failures taught a country what it did not want to become again. There is a strange poetry in the fact that the very families who tried to distance themselves from the masses ended up creating institutions that now serve the public. That the halls once walked by corseted heiresses are now visited by schoolchildren. That the art once hoarded in private galleries now hangs for all to see. And perhaps that is the final legacy: transformation. The Gilded Age did not endure as it was intended to, but it left behind something better than permanence. It left behind memory, lesson, beauty, and contradiction. It showed that wealth alone cannot hold back time, but when repurposed with vision, it can illuminate it. Stand at the corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street today, and you won't see any trace of the Vanderbilt Mansion. No ornate balconies, no soaring turrets, no towering marble entrance. In its place rises the sleek facade of Bergdorf Goodman, a monument to modern luxury and mass commerce. Shoppers hurry past displays of high fashion. Traffic hums. Digital billboards glow above what was once a parlor of gilded wood and silk tapestries. The most opulent private home ever built in New York has vanished, leaving behind not rubble, but something far more haunting: a silence in the shape of memory. The ghost of the Gilded Age lingers in these places, not as a spirit, but as a question. What was all of this for? It wasn't merely for comfort. The homes were too vast, too impractical, too ceremonial for that. It wasn't for necessity. No one needed a ballroom that could seat 500 or a library with books no one read. It was for legacy, for spectacle, for the assertion that some lives mattered more than others because they glimmered more brightly in the candlelight. But permanence is a fragile illusion. The mansions are gone. The footmen are gone. The society pages have folded. The families have scattered. The rituals have faded into stories told in documentaries, novels, and whispered conversations between museum walls. What remains are fragments: a panel here, a chandelier there, a black and white photo of a staircase now buried beneath concrete. And yet, despite its fall, the Gilded Age left behind a shape, an outline of American ambition in its most unrestrained form. It showed what could happen when wealth went unchecked, when dreams were built with no limits and no conscience. It gave us our first great age of inequality, our first national reckoning with the costs of industrialization, and our first reminder that a society cannot endure on glamour alone. What replaced it was not a utopia. The age of skyscrapers, jazz, and consumerism brought its own flaws, but it offered something different: speed, efficiency, access. The palaces were replaced by buildings anyone could enter. The private opulence gave way to public grandeur. Grand Central Terminal replaced drawing rooms. Department stores replaced salons. The aristocracy made way for modernity. Still, the ghost remains. It lives in the marble staircase of the Frick, worn smooth by generations of curious feet. It echoes in the reading room of the Morgan Library, where lamps glow beside ancient manuscripts. It flickers in the chandeliers of Newport, hanging above schoolchildren learning what a cottage once meant. These spaces remind us not only of how the powerful lived, but of how fleeting that power was. And it whispers one final lesson: that no fortune, no matter how vast, can shield against time. That the pursuit of grandeur, if untethered from purpose, becomes a mausoleum. That history does not preserve monuments for their size, but for their meaning. In the end, what endures is not the marble or the gold, but the story. The tale of an age that dreamed too big, consumed too much, and fell under the weight of its own splendor. That story is now ours to tell, to remember, to question. The gilded halls may be gone, but their ghost walks beside us every time we marvel at a skyscraper, question inequality, or step into a museum where once only the elite could go. The Gilded Age did not survive, but its echo is everywhere,